and was covered with straw. And the soldiers came looking for him, but thank goodness they didn't find him, because men were hauled off and sent to the first concentration camp, Buchenwald. And in order to get out of Buchenwald, you had to have a ticket and a passport out of Germany. Luckily, my family did have that. We had family in the United States who had sponsored us, but quota. We each had numbers. You never knew when your number would be called that you could go to the United States. I have had an uncle, my Uncle Selig, who was my father's brother, who was very much involved in Jewish affairs. He knew of the KinderTransport. He signed up my sister and I and my first cousin Richard, who were the only children in the family. And our parents, not knowing when they could get out, decided to send us on the KinderTransport. And that's my recollection of my early childhood. Let me give you over to Ruth.
Shall I go with the same question?
Yes, please.
Okay. I was born in February of 1928, and when Hitler marched into Austria on March 12th of 1938, I was just past 10 years old, and my brother was 6. We lived in a unique situation because my father worked for the Jewish community. He was in the social services department. And so we had an apartment in the largest synagogue complex in Vienna. My synagogue, which was the largest in Vienna, held 2,442 seats. It had 2 ladies' galleries, not just one, because it was so large. And my apartment looked directly into the synagogue, and just a courtyard between us. And the courtyard was my playground. We used to go to school from 8 to 1, came home for lunch, and then the kids started to come, Jewish, non-Jewish, everybody, because it was a safe space and we could act out our age. We could act out 10-year-old tag and noise and whatever we felt like doing. My brother was not yet in school. He was only 6. And we were going along. A couple of days after Hitler marched into Austria, my mother took me to the library, as we did every 2 weeks, and exchanged 2 books for 2 books. And this time the librarian wouldn't give me any books. And I asked why, and she said, because you're a Jew. And I said, I was a Jew 2 weeks ago. She said, don't ask me questions, just go home. You're not getting any books. You know, it still bothers me. And so then my mother couldn't go shopping for fresh vegetables and fruits before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And remember, it's 38, and there's no refrigeration, neither in our house, nor for the farmers that came in from the local farms. So by the time she got stuff, we were half dead. But she had to shop after 4, she could not shop before. And so it went. Every day it was different. And the next hurtful thing and injustice, which this is all about, came in May when they wouldn't let me go back to school. They had another school set aside. It was 2 or 3 trolley rides from the house, and it took over an hour to get each way. So my parents had enough, and they enrolled me in an old Jewish day school. And I finished out the term with that, and came back and started again in September. Then things got, every day something else happened. Every day one thing got worse than the other, until it got to November 9th, 1938, and that was the day of the 9th and 10th of Kristallnacht. And I think probably all of you have heard of it, so I'm not going to give you the background. But I remember where I lived, and we had 4 other families who were attached to the Jewish community in one way or another. The chief cantor and a few others, teachers. There were 4 other families, and they were all in my house before daybreak, and they were whispering to each other, so Walter and I couldn't hear, but they were scared to death, and that fright reflected in us as well, because we didn't know what was going on. At daybreak, the caretaker of the synagogue, who was not Jewish and who lived in the other building on the other side of the synagogue, came in and he said to my mother, Frau Monschein, get the kids out of here. And she packed a little bag for us, and she took us out into the suburbs to an old aunt of my father's, who was in her 70s. In those days, we thought that was old. And so she took us out there, she left us, and they thought we'd be safe with an old woman like that. And we were for a few hours, and then this big burly Nazi, and I'll never forget his face, came in and he said, you Jewish sow, you get out of here. This is no longer your apartment, it is now mine. And she cried, and she said, I have to take care of these children. And he said, I don't give a damn about the children, you do whatever you want to do. Get out, it's my apartment. And so what could she do? She packed our little bag and she took us back into the city. We get back into the city, we walked into our home, and we have a big oak door with 4 panels, 2 on top, 2 on the bottom. And there is a sticker across the door, and it says, no admittance, stay out, and there's a big swastika and a German seal there, so we couldn't get in the house. There's no mama, there's no papa, there's no Maria, our house people, who was not Jewish. So we went out into the street, and the street is lined with firefighting equipment, and the firefighters are standing next to it, and they're doing nothing. And Tante went over to one of them and said, you know what happened to their parents? Their parents, they were probably deported, because that's what they're doing that day. They were gathering all the Jews in the street, particularly the men, and they took, and they sent them to various concentration camps. Papa was sent to Dachau, we found out much later. The telephone is in the house, you can't get into the house. How do you communicate? There are no cell phones. And so we didn't know where Papa was. And finally, it was around 5 o'clock, and it was getting very dark. it's November, and some neighbors made us come upstairs because at this point the synagogue was blazing, and I know you all remember the horror of the fire of Notre Dame in Paris a few years ago, because we all looked at it on television, and this was like that. It was so frightening, and you can imagine the glass was broken and the beautiful stained glass windows, and it's crunched under your feet. I feel that every single day. And so they called us upstairs and they fed us and they put us to bed. And the next morning my mother was walking around looking, called her up. She was so surprised to see us. She didn't know what Papa was. And I had no idea. And then finally, she came upstairs as well, and she had slept down the street in somebody, another friend's home, but the janitor of that building told her she better get out, or he's gonna report her. And so it went from November 10th to November 20th, till we were able to get back into the apartment with help from the higher echelons in the Jewish community. We got inside, and there, whatever was not nailed down, and I'm serious, except for the pieces of furniture, everything was gone. They had punched out one of those lower panels. A skinny guy got in, and they took out everything. And I mean everything: bedding, clothing, Judaica, jewelry, pots and pans, dishes, whatever. There was nothing left except the furniture. Well, it was cold in Vienna in November, and we didn't have a blanket to cover ourselves with or a pillow to push out. And we had to start from the beginning, and with the help of friends and with some money, we got started with something, and there it was. And that was November 20th. Now I'm giving you all these dates because I want you to see how quickly one's life can change, and things taken away from you. Papa had a talent. He could interpret the most ridiculous and difficult documents that man can think of, and they thought of everything, and every day it changed. But at that point, Hitler wasn't ready to kill us Jews yet. He was wanted Germany and Austria to be Judenrein, that's clean of Jews. And so he wanted them all out. So they came for my father at Dachau after 36 hours, which was so lucky, it saved his life. And they put him to work at his office. He had a couch there, so he slept there. And they brought him food, and they made him work almost 24 hours a day to get all the people who could get out, who had papers or who had money, who could buy a visa for another country. And after about 4 days or so, I don't know how they got together, because in those days I didn't ask too many questions. A 10-year-old goes with the flow, that goes with it, particularly with my mother. My mother was one of those you didn't say no to. And Mama said, we did.
I said something.
Okay, now I'm holding it.
No, I just want to say something, because you just brought something up.
Please.
I just want to say something, that Ruth brought up, that when she said at that time Hitler wasn't killing us. So I want to make clear with the KinderTransports that, because I know when sometimes I talk to people about the KinderTransports, one of the first questions people ask is, why did the Germans let the KinderTransports go? So is that a question anyone asks? Like, why were the children let? So I want to make it really clear that at that point, until the start of the war when the borders are closed, the goal was to have Jews leave Germany and Austria with no money, with only 8 marks, but to leave. And the problem was that no country would take penniless Jewish refugees. So my mother was on a KinderTransport from Vienna, like Ruth, and my grandfather went from consulate to Shanghai, to Ireland, to the US, where his sister had been since 1925, saying, I'm a pharmacist, I have a daughter, she's 12, can you take me? And no country would take Jewish refugees. So the Dominican Republic took some. Britain made this outside of the quota system. They talk about the quotas a lot. So British Parliament met. They had special meetings right after Kristallnacht. And they said, what can we do? We don't want to take everyone, but what can we do to save the innocent children? So they made a deal that outside of the quota, they would take children. It's thought that it's around 10,000 children. It would have been more, but the war started.
That's the 50 pounds.
Yes, there was, okay, so in order to go on the KinderTransport, there had to be 50 pounds guaranteed for each child. This was set by Britain, not by Germany, to make sure they wouldn't fall on the public responsibility. That was raised mostly outside of Germany and Austria by Quakers, by Marks and Spencer, by all sorts of, the Archbishop of Canterbury did a newsreel saying, help with these children. There were some KinderTransports, like Dr. Ruth went to Switzerland. There were 500 to Sweden. There were some to the Netherlands, France. There were eventually 1,000 children to the US. But it really, the issue, a big issue was no country willing to accept Jewish refugees. So the KinderTransports were part of the German policy to have Jews leave the Reich. And I think that's really important to understand. And then I just want to say on behalf of the KinderTransport Association, because we have a threefold mission, which is to reunite Kinder and the next generations, and to educate about the KinderTransports as part of Holocaust history, and to support and advocate for children at risk today. So it's really wonderful that we can be part of this production that also is benefiting children in the Ukraine who are at risk today. So that's really meaningful.
That's when you know a lot about KinderTransport. That's how you get to hear these cogent explanations. And just wanted to say, I'll be done in a minute. When I gave you those dates, and here we were on November 20th back in the apartment, and on December 9th I came back from school on a Friday afternoon, and Mama said, tomorrow you go to Holland with Walter. And I said, I'm not going. I'm not leaving you here. I'm not going without you. But of course, like I said, Mama said, and you did, all right. And so that's made it December 10th, Saturday night. Papa was at the railroad station, checking off documents for kids, and we were 400 kids, and the parents on the railroad station. The train was just for us, and you can imagine the emotional impact at that railroad station. The parents didn't know if they'd ever see the kids again. Some of the kids thought it was a great adventure, and some kids were like me, who just had to go with the flow. And Papa said goodbye to us and said, see you in 6 weeks. And that I could get my head around. 6 weeks is possible. And that was my first day on KinderTransport. Oh, I'm sorry, Melissa. I didn't look left.
I'd like to ask a question. This particular play is somewhat of an anathema to the KinderTransport gestalt about a child not wanting to go back with their parent. that could have a dramaturge debate with the playwright at some point. But any feelings about abandonment, about your parents and?
All right, I was 5 years old when I went on the KinderTransport. Going to be 90 next month. You go with the flow, like Ruth said. Nope, it's not like today, where if the child crosses the street, you have to give them a read and explain everything. Woke up one morning, July, my mother put 3 layers of clothes on us, a winter coat, took us to the railroad station, got on a train, got on another train, a boat, went to England. Nobody explained anything. Didn't even think about seeing our parents again. At that time, they were not killing the Jews. So you just assumed you would see the parents again, we would be reunited. And when you're very young, you don't even think in these terms. And whatever's handed to you, you do. You go, and life goes on. Same today. Whatever handed to you, you go. What you can change, you change, and what you can't change, you accept. I was very moved by the play. Eva having to decide who to go with. I can understand it, because when my parents got out, my father left September 1st, 1939, the day war broke out. He came directly to the United States. The plan was for my mother to pick up my sister and I on her way here. But she left May 1941. United States, you could leave for the United States. The United States was not at war with Germany until December, Pearl Harbor. But the ship my mother was on could not go to England to pick us up. Also, England was no longer letting children cross the Atlantic, because there had been a ship load of children going to Canada, and it was sunk, and quite a number of the children died. So we were in England for 6 years. You have to remember, my parents sent a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, 2 little obedient children. What did they get? An 11-year-old and 13-year-old who had basically been independent. We always were very well taken care of. And we dreamed of warm, loving parents that we had had. I always say in England I had everything very well taken care of, but nobody ever hugged and kissed me and told me they loved me. And that's what I dreamed of. And my parents had a hard, like any immigrant, it was hard when they came here. They had nothing. Luckily, my parents we had wealthy family here who always helped us. But their life was work, eat, and sleep. You spent no money that was not absolutely necessary. And in England, my foster family was quite wealthy, and as Eva got on the train to be evacuated, Inge and I were evacuated. I lived in 5 homes my first 11 years. And thank goodness they were all very good homes, beautiful homes in fact. And we came to New York, to Washington Heights, to this old tenement. I wanted to turn around and go back to England. So I could understand Eva's dilemma. What was waiting for her? What was ahead of her? She knew what she had, she was happy with it. So she made her decision, which she paid for in her later life.
I guess we're up to dramaturgy, so this is good. As in the play, and without prodding too much, Eva had survivor's guilt, but you both were able to reunite with your family, as here, or in a tenement, but here. Was there any other contact with other KinderTransport children or anything?
Not until I joined the KinderTransport Association.
Right.
In 1992, my cousin saw an article in one of the Jewish papers about a reunion the KinderTransport was having at the downtown Marriott, a one-day meeting, and gave a phone number, and I went alone. I did not take my husband, I did not take my children. I had the best time. I never saw such a group of vibrant people. I mean, you could just feel the energy in the room. It was absolutely enlightening. And I was so happy that I had joined the KinderTransport Association. For a while, I was the treasurer.
I want to give again a little bit of context to this, is that after the war, survivors talked a little bit about their experiences and no one wanted to hear it. So they stopped talking. The KinderTransport children felt, in some cases in the US, they were teenagers on their own without their parents, trying to make new lives and new families. So they were focused on that. Those with their parents felt such guilt for that they were the lucky ones. They got out, nothing really happened to them, so they didn't talk about it. And their parents, to protect them, wanted to say, yes, you were so young, you don't remember, you're fine. So it wasn't until the 50th year after the KinderTransports in 1988 that Bertha Leverton, who was a kind in London, said, let's get together everyone who was on a KinderTransport. Because before, people had gotten together if they were in a hostel together or a school together. They had gotten together over the years in small family reunions. But so many were scattered throughout the UK in individual homes that they didn't meet each other. So in 1988, there was the first reunion in London, and over 1,200 people came from throughout Europe, from the UK, from the United States, from South America. So I was going to get to Nepal. Nepal is always my end there. From South America and from Nepal. Garrett, who I love. Australia, yeah. So, and after that, someone who had been in the U.S., who in fact knew people who he knew were also from Germany and Austria, but they never talked about their past with each other, and they all discovered they were on the KinderTransport. So they formed the KinderTransport Association in the US, which for many years had national reunions every 2 years. But there was this feeling for a long time that the Kinder were the lucky ones, so who are they to talk about anything? And it's really been only in the past 15 years that even the word KinderTransport, which can have other meanings also, but the meaning of KinderTransport as this rescue mission only made it into the Encyclopedia Britannica and accepted as a word with that meaning in the 1990s. Yeah, David Fisher was really involved with that, actually.
Wow.
But,
To parallel the play, what have you talked about your experiences with your children and families? Ruth? Start with you. What have you talked about with your experiences with your children and families? The character in the play hid it from them, but
I never thought I was a survivor until I realized that I had a story to tell. And I never talked about it, never talked about it to my husband. As a matter of fact, he used to say if she had an accent, I wouldn't have married her. So, I never discussed it with him until after the 6-Day War in Israel, when we were there in January of '68. And they had brought over Herzl's room from Vienna, just the way it was. And I had remembered it from the time I was 8 years old. And then I said, oh my God, I got a story to tell. It was, it's because of what Melissa has been doing as a second generation, and amazing work with KinderTransport, that it has become what it is today, and that we are always so happy to meet one another and to be with one another and to exchange experiences, and so when Melissa asks at one of the big meetings, how many of you were on the first KinderTransport, I'm looking around to see who else was on my KinderTransport, because I'm particularly interested in those people. So her work has been absolutely unbelievable. And with so much heart for all of us. She loves us all, and we love her. Isn't that right? Okay.
Alan, did you talk about your experiences with your children and family?
Yes. My sister and I were always together. And we spoke, I don't know, well, I have a wonderful foster family in England. So all through the years, we have been, from when we left, we have always been in contact with them, including today with the grandchildren. They come here, we go there for all occasions. So it was never put into a closet. We explain to our children and to our spouses, who were always very understanding and supporting us. And even today with my partner, he is very, very understanding and supportive of me. So I have always been very, very lucky. And the KinderTransport Association has contributed so much to my life. It has gotten me involved in organizations. I'm quite active in the Kruffenberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College, and I speak to the students. And so many of them are children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. And I tell them, talk to your parents. Ask them how they survived. If you came with them and had to adjust to this country, tell them how you feel. And don't sweat the easy stuff. What you can change, change what you can't. Try to live with.
I'd like to open it up to the floor if there are any particular questions about, a couple of hands from our cast. They're writing a dossier to get out and graduate on time. The gentleman here, I'll ask.
All right, how did you know about KinderTransport, and how were candidates chosen to be on these trains?
Yeah, this is a question for me. So it's how were children chosen to be on the trains? So the way people heard about the KinderTransport was word of mouth in the Jewish community, because by that point, everyone was looking for some way out. And so when they heard that there was a way to get children out, they would go for it. You had to go to the local Jewish community center, and the children had to fill out questionnaires. Initially, it was the first priority was supposed to be orphans or children whose parents were already in jail. They had to fill. I'm aware of that, but I'm also aware that I actually know the history. So I'm just trying to finish speaking. Yes, Ellen.
They tried to get the boys. They
Well,
tried
that
to
was-
get the boys out first.
That's anecdotal, but yes, there is some rumor that because boys aged like 10 to 15 were more at risk, they were trying to get them out. But everyone had to fill out lots of paperwork, lots of forms and questionnaires that social workers did, and then those papers were sent to the committees for the care of refugee children, which were very hastily organized in England, and then lists would come back saying this child, this child, this child. As Ruth said, she came home from school and was told the next day. Ellen too, parents often knew only 28 or 48 hours in advance. And because no one talked about the KinderTransports, they weren't studied very much. Like I did one of the only filmed interview with a social worker in Vienna that was ever done. So only now in the past 5 years are people really going into those records and starting to do serious research to answer questions like that, which everyone asks. How were the children chosen?
Thank you.
Any other question? Gotta ask Abby, she's done one.
Just a question. What was the youngest age that they would take, and what was the oldest?
So they were supposed to be 4 years old and able to carry their own little suitcase, but
Wow.
it is known that they took babies as young as 2 months. And also some people, I talked to someone who was a 12-year-old, so one of the older children, who someone handed her a baby through the window of the train that she took care of all the way to England, and then
Wow.
always her whole life wondered what happened to that child. The oldest were 17.
17.
Yeah.
We had an 18-month-old.
And Ruth had an 18-month-old on her first transport, yeah.
Wow.
Yes, yes.
On Tuesday, you had spoken about what happened to the synagogue in your building, and I wanted you to say it again because it was so moving.
On Tuesday, you spoke about what happened to the synagogue that was in your building, and she wanted you to speak about that again, yeah.
It was
When
so moving.
when we came back from the aunt, and the synagogue was a fire, and the firefighter said that they were instructed not to touch anything unless it got, it was endangering the surrounding buildings. And that's when we went up to the friends who motioned us up and took care of us. But we didn't know where our parents were or where our housekeeper was. We had no idea. And we really found Mama by accident the next morning when she was looking. And as I say, I was too dumb to ask questions in those days, 10 years old, I really didn't
I meant
know
what happened to it,
what was going on.
what happened to it now, like how it ended up now.
What's happened when you went back to visit?
Oh,
Yeah.
the synagogue was gone. 1955, the first time I went back. My brother was stationed in Germany at the big Ramstein hospital. And I went to meet him. He'd saved up, he was in the army, and he'd saved up time, so we traveled together. And we went to Vienna for 2 days, mostly because I wanted to check and see where the graves of my grandmother and my cousins and my aunts and uncles were in order, and they were. That's why we went. He didn't want to remember. When I talked to him about remembering this and that, I don't want to remember. I'm a tourist, and that's it. And leave my feelings alone. That was his answer to this. And the next time I went was in the 90s. I took my daughter and my daughter-in-law for a week because my daughter wanted to see where I came from. And when we went into the apartment, which stood, and I said, well, here's the kitchen, and where's the kitchen? What happened? All classrooms for Agudat Israel, the most religious of all Jewish sects, had a school there. And my daughter said, don't cry, Mama. This is revenge. They threw me out, and now you got the most religious of all having a class. And
Any other particular question? Yes.
So in the show, Evelyn and Ava, they have a doll that brought them comfort. Even if it was like a physical object or like if it was a person or like a thought, was there anything that you guys had that you can remember when you were younger that brought you any form of comfort?
No.
Was there like a thought that helped you continue going, or you just go?
I had my sister.
Aw.
Is there anything that you brought with you as a child that you really held on to sentimentally, or?
Or
my
even just
mother
like a
didn't
thought
give
or
us
a
anything
person.
to take. She would have none of my toys or anything. Wasn't important. The important thing was to get out, that's it.
Like in the play with the suitcase, you couldn't
I mean,
have anything, and our parents were sending us to strangers, and they didn't, well, my parents knew where we were going. And I'm sure they wanted us to be of no burden to them. So everything was put in the suitcase and off we went.
I mean, many kinder felt that leaving was the end of their childhood. So there was this separation, and it's not, a few have been able to hold on to things throughout the years, but it's fairly rare.
Yes, sir.
So, Ellen, you told us how you reunited with your parents and, getting to the U.S. and the living conditions being different and all that, but Ruth, you also reunited with your parents? I don't
Yes,
know that we know
my
about that.
my father told you, thank you. My father's at 6 weeks, so their third time he wrote it in the letter, 6 weeks. I said, Papa, please, I'm not stupid. It's been 3 times 6 weeks, when is it gonna be? And he said, honey, I really don't know. So we came on October 26, 1939, Walter and I came by ourselves. And then my parents followed on November 17th, just 3 weeks later. So the 6 weeks came through by hand.
We're gonna have to wrap up, yes, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to know if we have statistics, how many kinder children were actually lucky enough to reunite with their families?
Oh, I think, what, 300?
No.
So the question is, how many KinderTransport children did really reunite with a parent or parents? And that's one of those questions. Initially, it was thought that 80% of the parents were murdered. Now it's thought it's more like 60%. But it's one of those, because you would have to find a list, which is more difficult than you would imagine, to find a list of all the names of all the children who were on the KinderTransports from throughout Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and then trace back their parents, and nobody's tried to do that yet. So it's anecdotal.
In fact, there was a fire in England.
There wasn't a fire. That's one of those.
Or they destroyed
So-
the records, so they don't have a complete list of everyone that was on the KinderTransport.
Well,
I
what they
think-
don't have is a complete list. In theory, there should be a complete list in England of all the children who arrived in England, and that after children were out of their foster homes, so no longer in the care of the Committee for the Care of Refugee Children, the records were destroyed because they didn't need them anymore, because they didn't think they would have any value. So, like I've never able to find any information about my mother in England. So yeah, so it's a hard ask. Yeah.
Well, there was the Bloomsbury house
Yes.
that had the records of the children. And I know some of the kinder who were put into homes or whatever, were very mistreated. The older ones had the guts to pick themselves up and go to Bloomsbury House and were placed in other, but some of the children were absolutely abused. Very, very pathetic.
Yes, Shoshana.
I have a question. So, as you two were on the KinderTransport, I was curious about your thoughts on Faith's character and how she went about trying to figure out about her mother's past, and whether you think you could see where she was coming from, or you felt like maybe she was kind of in the wrong.
So the question was, in regards to the play's fictional character, of the young daughter trying to figure out her past history, with her mother not telling her history,
What's their perspective on that?
what's their perspective? Well, their own personal histories is they didn't have that issue.
Right.
So there's that.
I knew my story.
I can tell you from the second generation point of view, is it's always mixed. It's so, like my own mother, I grew up knowing just bits and pieces. I knew she had been born in Vienna. I knew she had been sent on a train, but it wasn't until I started doing research for a film that I made that I learned that she was one of these 10,000 children. She thought she had been open and told me everything, but I always knew that there were things I couldn't ask her about and things she wouldn't say, because there's this generational protectiveness where you think they'll break. Of course they won't break. They're really strong and resilient, but we want to protect them and they want to protect us because they don't want to trouble us with what they went through as children. Why should they bring that to bear on their good American children? Also, they were struggling to make new lives for themselves in a new country and wanted to be American. I have one second generation friend, and I love her mother, but her mother was like, no, we're an American family. And every time they would say, well, but Mom, you have an accent. She's like, well, everyone has accents, you know? So there's this mutual protectiveness, and there are some who really don't talk and who never told, but more, there's this bits and pieces, and if everyone on both sides is hesitating to ask, because also, when you're a teenager, if your parent is telling you something really serious to them, What if you don't react, they're afraid, what if the teenager or child isn't gonna react in a way that the parent can deal with? So it's, there's a desire to share, and there's so many barriers to it also.
The first time my children and my husband really found out my whole story, I made a film for the Shoah Foundation, where I had a facilitator who asked questions, brought out such emotions, remembering things I had completely forgotten. But again, the KinderTransport Association really made us comrades or whatever, where we could compare notes and emotions, and a wonderful, wonderful outlet for all of us.
One more question from Mom.
You were reunited with your parents pretty quickly, a matter of, a short amount of time. How about you and your mom?
6 years.
6
Wow.
years. 6 years.
As I said, I was 5 and then I was
Yeah.
11
6 years.
when I was reunited, and we never could really form a relationship until I got married and had my own children, and could go through the emotion. Typical example, the Cuban crisis. I don't think too many of you were alive at that time. I had a 2-year-old. What if they dropped a bomb? What if I was killed? And I had a 2-year-old wandering the streets alone with no one to take care of him. I was hysterical. I said, what would I do? I think I would have killed him.
And how about your mom? Did she,
Mine?
before she was reunited with
Um,
her parents?
Yeah, my mother, my mother and her mother were both born in Austria, so they were on the Austrian quota to the US. And they could have left in October of 1938, but my grandmother refused to leave without her husband, who, even though he was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and fought for Austria in World War I, after World War I, where he was from was named part of Poland, so he was on the Polish quota, and my grandmother refused to leave without him. It's now Ukraine, actually, so he's now from Ukraine. But, so they were waiting, so they were able to get out right before Pearl Harbor. They picked up my mother in England, and they went to America together, but they were not living together for nearly 2 years, and my mother felt always that her childhood had been broken and she couldn't rebuild a relationship. And she would say to me when I was a teenager and not the most delightful child, she would say, I don't know how to parent a teenager. I didn't have parents when I was a teenager, which was not helpful to either of us. But so her parents got out, her father's brothers were murdered, and her cousin Pauli was killed in Auschwitz when he was 5 years old. So, yeah.
Tough segue. Very tough segue. There's something that I've learned since starting to produce the show since last May when we put it on the books, dealing with what was happening in the world politically, even delving into this, although I know it existed not to this extent historically, but the most amazing experience of meeting Ellen and meeting Ruth and Melissa and the organization and the camaraderie of these 2-3 women and our cast, and watching them grow and understand the situation, and our students, who is hopefully their eyes are not open just to history, but to what's happening now. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for staying and listening to our history.